In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about why the assessment objectives are so important for your English literature essays. In this video, why is it important to know what those assessment objectives are? Well, if you don't know what the assessment objectives are, you don't really know what it is you should be doing in each essay to get the marks that you deserve. So, have a little look at the AOs that are on the screen there. They might look a little bit complicated, but we'll break them down so we know exactly what we should be doing to hit each of those. But first, we've got a few questions to answer. Why is it important to... Well, the short answer is yes. You have to include those AOs, but really, they're going to be included naturally in the way that you write. This lets us deviate away from just retelling the story, which you're not going to get any marks for. Now, every exam board has to complete these AOs. So it's not like your friend in another school is getting an easier ride because they don't have to hit these AOs. It's the same across every exam board. Well, the short answer is yes. Now, the first thing we need to bear in mind is that these assessment objectives, although they are all important, aren't equally weighted. As you can see there, AO2 is worth considerably more than AO3 and slightly more than AO1. So obviously that's where the bulk of your essay needs to be from. But what are each of those AOs? Now the first thing we need to bear in mind is that... So, our first AO is AO1, and as you can see it's worth 37.5% of your total English literature GCSE. Now, I'm not going to read it out because it's there on the screen, but let's have a look at some of those key words that are in there. So, maintain a critical style and use textual references. That's what builds the bulk of AO1. So first, if we think about maintaining a critical style, how many times have your teachers told you that something sounds a little bit too chatty? This is where that comes in. We need to make sure our essays are both formal and critical. Okay? They need to be, well, to get those top grades, 8 and 9, almost like an A-level essay nowadays. Now for our textual references, mainly that's quotations. But then again, that's something that you're going to be including by default, right? If you aren't including quotations, what are you possibly analysing or commenting on? That's why every paragraph should be based upon a quotation. I'm sure you've been told that by your teachers in the past. So, our first... Now, AO2 is our biggest assessment objective that we need to be hitting when we write these essays. To analyse the language, form and structure using relevant subject terminology. Interesting. What does it really mean? Now, let's take the quotation, "unsex me here," from Macbeth, said by Lady Macbeth. If you were to say something like, this quotation shows that Lady Macbeth wants to be a man. Well, I guess so, in its most basic sense. But that's just explaining it. How can we analyse it? What does that verb unsex really suggest? Maybe that she wants to rid herself of any feminine qualities and become more manly. Now, we can then link that into our third assessment objective, AO3, where we need to start including context. But we'll get to that shortly. The most important thing is that when you are discussing a quotation, you don't just explain what it means, but you analyse the effects of it. What does that quotation make a reader think or feel? What is the effect it has on that reader? Now your third assessment objective is AO3, and as you can see it's worth, well, a lot less than the others, only 15% of your total English literature GCSE. But that doesn't mean it should be discounted. To show understanding of the relationship between text and context in which they are written is very important in creating an entire argument for your essay itself. It helps us to understand what was going on at the time and why a writer might have included a certain fact or idea in their text. For example, we look at the inclusion of the witches in Macbeth. Obviously, the monarch at the time, King James, was very interested in the supernatural. One could argue that the witches' inclusion in the play was to impress King James. At the time, the previous monarch was very gracious towards the theatre companies. Without there being a monarch to support them, they wouldn't have been able to exist in the way they did. Obviously, for King James to carry on supporting that, they would need to impress him. Now, this is an example of contextual information. It helps back up your argument and also gets you some marks at the same time. Now, your third assessment objective is A. Now, what you've got on screen is an exam-style question for an inspector calls. How and why does Sheila change in an inspector calls? And it says underneath what you can write about: how Sheila responds to her family and to the inspector, and also how Priestley presents Sheila by the way he writes. Underneath that, you've got something called the indicative content. Now, whilst you won't get this in the actual exam, you might have seen this in class or if you've looked at any mark schemes in the past. It basically tells you what you could include to hit each of those assessment objectives and to get the required marks to get the grade you deserve. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, indicative content is what the exam board think you should or could be including to hit each of those assessment objectives. Now, it's important to note that these things underneath AO1, 2 and 3 don't necessarily link together. For example, Sheila's initial attitude towards Eva doesn't necessarily link to the first one under AO2, comments on effects of particular stage directions related to Sheila. But they all can be included in your response. For example, underneath AO1, Sheila's initial attitude towards Eva, we could find a quotation to show that, hitting our AO1 mark, analyse it, and use some subject terminology possibly, hitting our AO2 mark, and then link that to context, hitting our AO3 mark. For example, why was Sheila behaving that way, and possibly why did Priestley decide to change her character throughout the play? Indicative content is what the... As I say, these things aren't the only things you can be focusing on, but they are the kind of things that the exam board would like to see. So as you're going through planning a response, if you can possibly build your own indicative content, it might be useful. What kind of things might you want to see under AO1? What kind of things might you want to analyse under AO2? And what kind of contextual information might you want to link it to hit those AO3